Good morning, everybody. I hope you all know who I am. If you don't know who I am, I'm Nicholas Dionysopoulos. You can just call me Nicholas. Don't try to pronounce the very difficult Greek last name. I'm the lead developer and owner of Akiba Limited. We're making things like Akiba Backup, admin tools, Akiba subscriptions, and a few other extensions. And today, I'm here to talk about active JOOMLA security. How to make your site a little bit more secure. Now, this is a mission impossible because I will try to say everything that I can tell you about JOOMLA security in 30 minutes or less. But I will try. I want your help though. Please don't try to take any notes because I'm going to give you a link to the presentation at the end of the presentation. So just sit back, enjoy, try not to sleep. Okay. So, a site is like a building. When you want to have a strong building, a secure building, the first thing you need to have is strong foundations, then carefully construct it, and of course, maintain it for its entire lifetime. This is exactly what you have to do with your site just as well. So, let's begin with the strong foundations. What are the foundations of a site? Well, if it was a building, you would say that the foundation is where the building is sitting on top so that it won't collapse. A site sits on a server. So you have to make sure that your server setup is fine-tuned to, let's say, not be insecure. The first thing you have to make sure, of course, as with everything which has to do with software and computers, is that you update everything very frequently. And mind you that servers also use software like PHP, MySQL, your web server package, which might be Apache or Nginx, Lite or whatever you're using. The FTP server, the email server, all this has to be up to date. Now, this may sound like something which is self-understood, but if you're on very cheap hosting, especially some guys which our friends in America have seen in NASCAR, I'm not going to name them, but you'll know who they are. They're not exactly up to date unless you consider something which is 5 years old up to date. In computer terms, this is 2 lifetimes and a half. So please try to find a host who understands this very basic thing. Another thing that you have to make sure, and it's actually your responsibility, it's a shared responsibility between you and your host, but you have to make sure about that, is that you have correct permissions and ownership. Now, how many people understand what ownership means? Just a few of you. Okay, so I will try to give you the executive summary. Most servers are based on Linux, but the same principles also apply in Windows. But I will try the Linux stuff because it's the most common that you will find in server environments. Each file and directory is owned by a user and by a group. Now, also, every process on the server, including your web server, runs under a user and a group. If you're able to write to a file, read a file, write things in a directory, or see the contents of a directory, depends on the ownership of both that file or directory, the ownership of the server process, and the permissions. So, if you ask me what are the correct permissions, I will simply reply, I have no idea, because I have to know about the ownership of the files and the server software running on your server. And we have the typical case of shared hosting. How many of you are using shared hosting? Let's try it in reverse. How many of you have dedicated servers? Okay, that's good. How many of you have a VPS? Everybody who doesn't have a dedicated server or a VPS is using shared hosting. So let's try again. How many of you are using shared hosting? All right. Now, on shared hosting, there can be 2 different ways to set up the server. In one configuration, the web server runs under its own user, which is usually HTTPD or www-data. If you're wondering why these word names, it's because they are the defaults in many Linux distributions. And your files are owned by another user. When you upload something by FTP, you will figure out that when you try to write to it with JOOMLA, you cannot. So how many of you had to ever set up 0777 permissions? Yeah. So at some point, you had to use 077 permissions in order to make something readable. Now, those of you who had to do that are definitely on a shared server, which is the setup that I'm going to talk about. Now, the best approach is to have everything owned by the FTP user, which means that when you're uploading your site, please use FTP. If you're restoring a backup with Kickstart, there is an option which allows you to use to upload files by FTP, extract them, and use FTP to write the files to the server. And this is very important because otherwise, all your files and directories are owned by a global user, let's say HTTPD, and this global user can write to the files. Now, this user, which is the user under which your server runs under, is not only used by your site, but by every site on that server, which pretty much means that if your files and folders are owned by this global user, anybody who has a site on the server can read and write to your files. And I bet that you don't really want that, right? Again, it sounds self-understood, but you would be amazed by the amount of sites which have been hacked because of this very basic thing. It is actually the single most common way to hack a site. Because I can hack an old site or a site using a different CMS, let's say something which is using WordPress 2.0, which hasn't been updated in ages on that server. And as a hacker, then I'm in the server and I can write to your very secure JOOMLA sites files. And you're hacked. And you're then screaming on the forum that JOOMLA is insecure. No, JOOMLA is not insecure. But if your server is insecure, then you're hosed. So what are the correct permissions in this particular case? If all your files and folders are owned by JOOMLA's FTP user, you can use 0755 permissions for folders and 0644 permissions for files. And in this case, you should also enable JOOMLA's FTP mode. How many of you have seen that those options in the global configuration? Okay, those of you who haven't, please make a mental note. As soon as I finish this presentation, go to your site, global configuration. Up there are some tabs. Click on System, and look further down the page. You will see Enable FTP and all the FTP fields. They're there for a reason, and that's a reason. Now, on this kind of setup, at some point, you will need to have a folder with 777 permissions. What are those folders? It's basically the temporary directory. Because when you're using the temporary directory, JOOMLA is not trying to use FTP, and it does that for a very good reason. It needs to be able to write somewhere some temporary files so that it can upload them with FTP. Now, when you use 777 permissions, you can protect the directory with a small .htaccess file, provided that you're using Apache, which is most likely the case. And the .htaccess file is actually very simple to remember, because it's this thing, order deny, allow, which tells Apache that the first thing you should do for this directory is deny access unless I tell you to, deny from all, allow from none. It's very simple, right? You tell Apache that nobody should ever be able to access any file on this directory. Why is that important to have that in this kind of 777 permissions directories? Even if a hacker manages to upload some malicious code in this directory, he won't be able to run it in the context of your website. So he will not be able to hack you just as easily. he will still be able to hack you if he really tries, but it's not going to be a piece of cake. Now, I know that this is all too much to remember, so when you will download the presentation, you can find two things which I have written. The first thing is in the Akiba Backups User's Guide, there is a whole chapter which is called Security Information, where I present all of that much better than I can present it on stage. It's something that you actually have to read twice, 3 times, 4 times, in order to figure out how it works. On the first reading, it will be like, huh. On the second, you will say, hey, now I kind of understand how that works. And if you want the executive summary, you can read another article which I have written in my blog, and it has been also republished in the JOOMLA community magazine, which is called 777, the number of the beast. And I promise you there are no religious stuff or cult stuff there. There's just an image of a dragon. That's all. Okay. So this is pretty much the basic stuff that you can do on your server. There are also some advanced stuff for IT ninjas and those with dedicated servers. Those of you without dedicated servers, you can ignore the next few slides. A very good idea is to filter all incoming traffic to your server and make sure that no malicious requests actually make it to JOOMLA. And this can be accomplished with a few security modules for Apache, like Mod Security or Modivasi. These are, let's say, active state firewalls. They monitor the incoming traffic. They try to match it against some patterns which are known to be used by the bad guys and decline the request. You need some rules for them. You can write your own rules if you're an Uber geek, or you can just do what everybody else does and use some pre-made rules. The most famous rules are the atomic rules. If you're on a shared host and your host uses Mod Security, then probably this is what they're using. Another alternative are the OWASP rules, which are more strict, and I wouldn't recommend them unless you really want to start tweaking them. And of course, if you're building your own web server, it's kind of hard remembering to do everything right on the first time. It also takes a lot of time to do that. So is there an easier way to do that? Well, there is. There are some scripts which allow you to build a secure server setup. One of the most famous scripts is TuxLite, T-U-X-L-I-T-E. It works with Ubuntu Server and allows you to create a quite secure server environment. But if you're hardcore, there are some other alternative scripts. One of them was written by a member of the JOOMLA community, Matt Thomas, and you can find it on GitHub. It is being updated all the time. And remember that this applies only to those of you who have dedicated servers and are willing to build and configure the server from scratch. It's not for Joe average. Okay. Now, let's begin with the second step of having a site, which is careful construction. Now, this is something that everybody start listening again. I'm not talking about dedicated servers. This is basic stuff. Well, talking about basic stuff, well, you have to update, preferably yesterday. Whenever you see a developer pushing out a new release, it means that it's fixing some bugs, and some of those bugs could potentially be used by the bad guys to hack your site. So keep an eye on updates and install them. Make a list of all the extensions that you're using on your site. All of those extensions provide some way to figure out if there are updates. If there are updates, install them at once. This also applies to JOOMLA itself, as well as all of your extensions, which are components, module, plugins, and templates. Yes, templates actually use PHP code. There's no point updating all your components, your modules, your plugins, and having a template which was developed 2.5 years ago. The chances are that the PHP code, which was being used back then in the template has some bugs. All major template clubs issue updates of their templates. Remember that. When you're updating your site, also update your templates, because it is also a quite common way to hack sites, especially with things like cross-site scripting attacks. Which brings me to my next point. Well, think before installing anything on your site. The JOOMLA community has an excellent resource, which is called the JOOMLA extensions directory, with over 10,000 extensions right now. If an extension is listed there, you will see that it has some feedback, so you can figure out if this is a legitimate extension. You can actually look up the developer and see if this is somebody that you should trust because he's a well-respected community member, or if he is someone that you have never heard of. If it's someone you have never heard of, at best, he will probably have some bugs because he's new in the JOOMLA development scene. But there are also some cases where he can be outright malicious. And if this can happen with the JOOMLA extensions directory, which is also pretty much monitored by the community, and the bad extensions are weeded out, imagine what can happen when an extension is listed nowhere. So you go to this shady website that you have never heard of, which is offering free templates. You say, oh, free templates. Let's download them all and install them. Well, there's a newsflash. Some of them actually take other developers' free templates, or they take paid templates, they put them out for free with a small change. They include some backdoors to your site. So as soon as you install this template from the entrusted source, you can rest assured that your site will be hacked in a matter of hours or days. So think twice before installing an extension on your site. Make sure that you really need that extension, and make sure that it comes from a trusted source. Okay, now, gentlemen, I'm going to tell you something which is a little upsetting. Length matters. This didn't come out very nicely. Sorry, your password's length matters. Much better. So, why does it matter? It matters because of this. Now, this doesn't look like a threatening, menacing monster, but it actually is. This is a rig, a small computer, which has 4 very powerful graphics cards. As you may have heard, graphics cards can be used for doing generic computation, like breaking passwords. This particular machine, it can chew about 33 billion passwords every second. 2 years ago, it used to cost $2,700 US dollars. Right now, I think it costs about half of it. So it's within the reach of pretty much any serious hacker, right? If these guys are breaking into a site, they're making money. So this is peanuts for them. And what the existence of this machine means for your password length and the security. Well, let's take some examples. A very common password, just numbers, like your telephone number, like a date. Okay. How many of you have ever used a password which is a date? None of you? Well, even part of it, yes.
Yeah, but it has another.
Okay, that's pretty good. So if you only have numbers, this machine will take 0.00038 milliseconds. It actually takes me about 1 billion times more to say the number than it lasts. So your password is cracked, right? If you're using admin, no. Who's using admin? Who has ever used admin? Come on, be brave.
Local development on its end.
Okay, but it's still admin. You know what can happen? you're developing on the site, then you create a normal super administrator, you forget about admin, you publish the site, and you're screwed. Okay. So admin is a little more secure. It takes 0.00185 milliseconds. Yeah, doesn't stand a chance, right? Then again, you can use something like this thing, which is a big string of random characters. This is a little more secure. It will take about 200 years to crack. Or if you want to be hardcore and future-proof and make sure that with the technology in the foreseeable future, it will not be a crackable password, you can go overboard and use numbers, lowercase letter, uppercase letters, special characters, etc. Have a very long password. I believe this is 14 characters or something like that. It will last for 340 million years, but it has a small problem. Please recite the password. You cannot remember it. So what you will do is that you will take a piece of paper, write it down, and glue it on the monitor. Or, even worse, you say, hey, I'm smart. I'm not putting it on the monitor. I'm putting it under the keyboard. Well, the monitor, under the keyboard, and under your desk are the first three things that an intruder in your business will look for when looking for passwords. So, not really secure because you cannot remember it. So, what happens is that if you have a secure password, you can't remember it. If you have a password you can remember, it's not secure, right? Well, wrong. You can actually have something like that. This example is taken from the webcomic XKCD. Horse correct battery stapler. These are 4 random words, okay, which do not make a sentence. So it's very difficult for someone to guess them because they mean nothing. It's very easy to remember them. If you look it up on Google, you will find the comic and you will see how easy it is to remember it with a mental image. He has read the comic. That's why he's laughing. And it will take a few billion years to crack. Now, if the cracker is really smart and uses a dictionary to perform a dictionary attack, it will only stand a few dozen years. But you can also be much smarter than a cracker, and you can use words from different languages, as long as you make a mental picture and remember what the password is. So there you have it. You can have a password which is both secure and easy to remember. Now, another thing that you should do to protect yourself against hackers is to lock your site down. I have a motto that nothing on my site runs unless I say so. What I mean is that there's no way that you can run an arbitrary PHP file which is somewhere in my site. Because, you know, JOOMLA actually only uses 2 PHP files which should be web accessible. It's index.php in your site's root directory, and it's index.php inside your administrator directory. Anything else should not be web accessible. And why is this thing important? Well, if I am a hacker, I can find a vulnerability on your site which allows me to upload arbitrary files. Or if we are on the shared hosting example, which I mentioned earlier, I can take one of those malicious files and put it in with an inconspicuous file name inside one of your sub directories in your site. So, for example, if I go into components, com-something, /views, /whatever, /tmpl, and put a file named readme.php, you will probably not figure out that this is a malicious file, but it can actually be a C99 variant, which gives a hacker superpowers on your site. You really don't want the hacker to be able to access those arbitrary PHP files. So I have 2 solutions for you, but they're not the only solutions. The first solution is my master.txt access file, which is free of charge. You can customize it. It has instructions in there, but you have to pretty much understand what .txt access file is and how that works and how you have to edit it. Or you can use something like Admin Tools Professional, which includes the .txt access maker, which pretty much offers a web interface to create a .txt access file based on the master.txt access. I'm going to give you the slides of the presentation at the end, okay? You don't have to take pictures. Now, speaking of Admin Tools Professional, well, it's a good idea to armor up. Install a security extension on your site. Now, please note that absolutely no security extension will make your site invulnerable to hackers. There is no such thing. If there was such thing, there would be no hackers, right? We'd all install something and be done with it. We would include it in the JOOMLA core and would have the one secure CMS in the world. Of course, this is a myth. What a security extension can do is that it can protect you from most easy to prevent attacks. You know, you may have a slightly outdated extension on your site that you forgot to update because we're all humans, and if you're managing, let's say, 50 websites or 100 websites, it's easy to forget something. And there are script kiddies who will download one of those hacking scripts. They don't understand how they work. They will run them nevertheless against your site, and ooh, they got in. But with the security extensions, these kind of attacks are no longer possible. Plus, you will have some more things which can either enhance the security of your site or at least give you some reporting on what is going on. It doesn't have to be my extension. I mean, there are pretty much half a dozen security extensions out there. Now, the other thing that you should do with your site is active maintenance. Well, okay, you built it, you made sure you follow the procedures to have a pretty much secure site, but security is not something that you install once and forget about it. It's something that you need to maintain over time. One very major thing that you should always do with your site is take backups. The 3 rules for backups are take backups, and take backups. These are the 3 rules, okay? Now, remember that you can never have enough backups. You can never have enough copies of your backups, and that an untested backup is not a backup. So, have frequent, automated, and off-site backups. Frequent because your site changes over time, and you don't want to lose, let's say, a month or a year of information on your site. So make it frequent. Don't ask me how frequent, it depends on your site. It should be automated, because otherwise, after doing a backup for, let's say, a couple of days, you will say, well, screw that. I'm not going to take another backup. I will remember it next week or next month. You never do. So you end up with a backup which is a year old when your site crashes, and you're screwed. And I receive a lot of emails telling me, all I have is a backup from last year, can I do something about it? Yeah, you can invent a time machine and go back in time. Offsite, because, well, let's say that you take a backup and store it on the same server as your site. Now, what happens if the server is infiltrated? What happens if the hard disk crashes? Or what happens if your host goes bankrupt? It has happened. There was there was a big site hosting blogs, and suddenly, one day, the site was there no more. The host went bankrupt, and the colocation service they were using, they repossessed the servers. So the guy who owned the site got screwed because all his backups were on the same servers that were repossessed. So do what the common wisdom says and don't have all your eggs in one basket. And of course, test your backups. Every time you do a major change in your site or do an upgrade of the backup software, take a backup and do a test restoration. I mean, if you don't test your backup, it's very possible that you have a broken backup, or that you're taking every day a broken backup that you cannot use. This is also something which has happened. Okay? You don't want it to happen to yourself. Besides backups, you should also monitor file changes. If a file changes, especially a .php file changes, and it's not because you have installed something or you have upgraded an extension, it could mean that your site is infiltrated, even if your site continues to function properly and doesn't look like it's hacked. One method used by many hackers is that I'm going to infiltrate your site today, upload my malicious code, and wait for a month, 2 months, 6 months, and then hack your site. Now, naturally, when you see your site is hacked, you will try to restore a backup. Well, tough luck, my malicious code is in your backups. And I bet that you're not going to restore a 6-month-old backup. When you try to figure out how you were hacked, you're going to look through your logs. Well, the problem is that after a few months, you have probably gotten rid of the logs. So you can no longer figure out how infiltrated your site. So even if you remove my malicious code, I can hack you all over again. And this is why it's very important to monitor file changes. In Admin Tools Professional, we have a PHP file change scanner, and I'm pretty sure that there are at least another 2 different security extensions which do the same thing. Speaking of monitoring, you should also monitor your logs. There are a few things that you can check, like what could be malicious SQL code, database commands. Database commands should never be part of the URL a user is trying to visit, or something which looks like line noise, /0x blah blah blah, /0x blah blah blah. This is probably an attempt of a hacker doing a cross-site scripting attack against your site. Pretty much, if you monitor things like that, you can figure out what hackers are trying to do to your site and protect your site against them. For example, by creating .htaccess rules or updating your mod security rules. Now, I know that this is advanced stuff, and it only makes sense to do that on a regular basis if you have a high-value target, like a site which brings you in a lot of money. It doesn't make sense to do that on your personal blog, on your personal blog, for example. Now, in spite of it all, you're hacked. Well, it's inevitable. It's like death and taxes. It will happen. So, what do? First thing, don't panic. There are some instructions which you can follow. I have written a small guide about unhacking your site, which pretty much tells you how to figure out what happened by reading the logs, etc., and making sure that you clean your site, restore backups. Well, you do have backups, right? Tested, frequent, off-site, automated backups. Yeah? If you don't, you're screwed. And of course, there's a problem with those instructions. When you're under stress because your site is hacked, you don't have the time or the mind to read through 5 pages long instructions. It's just impossible. You cannot do that. So do yourself a favor, read the instructions today that your site is up and running, and if the inevitable happens, well, you will be familiar with the process. So it will be much easier carrying it out. Now, one more thing. Security is a process. It's not something that you can ever say, I installed security on my site. No. Whatever you do today may not be enough tomorrow, because your site evolves, because hackers evolve. So make sure that you go back to your sites and reassess the security measures which you are using. Sometimes you will be surprised by the small changes you can make to make your site much more secure. Questions? And while we're at questions, this is where you can download the presentation. Yeah.
Say, for example, on my server, use HTTP special for configuration. What is key? And this is also, I know I have your computer admin tools, professional also.
Yeah.
Can I also create rules for that?
If you can add rules to the master.hc access, well, you can.
Normally it's a bit painful for the process. So normally I have to put just any htaccess file. I just have to take it, and most of the time, and you say, oh, just put in that folder. The htaccess will tell you correct. If I use HTTP special, I always have to include the folder for which the htaccess file normally would have went to.
I don't understand your server setup actually. The master, the .hc access created by admin tools professional goes into the root of your site. By default, it forbids access to all PHP files which are in any directory except the index.php file in the root and the administrator directory. Some extensions stupidly use their own .php files. There are very few valid reasons to do that, but well, many extensions do that anyway. You can add those rules in the .htaccess maker configuration screen and then create your .htaccess file. And if you want to forbid access to a specific directory, then you can use custom code.
Yeah,
You can append or prepend your custom instructions in .htaccess maker. It's a feature that there's been there for I don't know forever. Okay, so another question? Yeah.
What is the strategy with the problem of upgrading JOOMLA and having especially open security on the host?
What do you mean when you say upgrading? You mean migrating from a major version to another, like 1.5 to 2.5? When you use a newer JOOMLA version, there are, of course, many security issues which have been fixed in the meantime. So in the future, there might be some security vulnerabilities discovered in JOOMLA 2.5, which might also affect JOOMLA 1.5.
Sorry, that's not what I mean. I mean there's an upgrading
Yes.
mechanism in JOOMLA
Up-
which you can start in the administrator
Yes.
end.
Yes.
But it only works if the hoster has an open
No.
mod or something
no, that-
configuration.
No. You will have to go back to the slide where I was talking about permissions.
Yes.
So, if I will tell you, if your files are owned by the web server user, then you can use the direct method in the JOOMLA updater to update your site. However, this is very insecure. If you upload all your files with FTP, then you say that you need to use 777 permissions to be able to update JOOMLA. This is not entirely correct, because on that page, on the JOOMLA update page, it says, it asks you how to write to the files, and it has direct write or upload by FTP. So this is what you have to do, upload by FTP. And I think that if you have enabled FTP options in your global configuration, it will automatically pick them up. Admin tools does. I really don't remember when I created the variant which is included in the JOOMLA core if I also did the same thing, because I wasn't allowed to do some of the stuff that I do in admin tools. But in a configuration,
The error message you get is a bit misleading. It tells you there's an option not set on your host. Yes, allow URL open is not configured.
okay, if you see that error message, it means that your host doesn't actually understand how PHP works.
Okay.
Back in
Anybody here from Midtown? No?
Well, I will tell you why. Back in PHP 4, you could either disable allow URLF open, or enable it. It was a binary switch. If you disabled it, then it would disable opening URLs which have a HTTP in front, let's say, or FTP. And it would also disable being able to include files using URLs. Now, the insecure stuff is including files. So ever since PHP 5.0, yes, PHP 5.0, there are two options, which is, what's it called? Allow URL include and allow URLF open. What you need to disable is allow URL include, not allow URLF open. Allow URLF open is very safe to have turned on. And most hosts have not realized that for the past 4 years or so. So they're disabling the wrong option. They're disabling the option which is innocent in order to protect you from something they could do by disabling another option. So you have to go back to your host and tell them, please read the fine PHP manual. Okay. Yeah, they're up front. Well, yes. It's in the manual. Another question? No questions? Okay, so thank you for listening.